A woman is buried in a city that had granaries, drainage systems, and standardized weights, 4,500 years before anyone would call it engineering. Her bones sit underground for millennia. Her DNA, by every normal rule of tropical preservation, should have disintegrated centuries ago. And when a team finally coaxes a readable genome out of her after more than 100 failed attempts, what they find does not confirm the story India had been told about itself for over a century. It rewrites it. Somewhere else, in a different lab, 523 other ancient skeletons are being compared against each other, stretching from the grasslands of Kazakhstan to the deserts of Iran to the river valleys of Pakistan. A genetic signal is moving south, generation by generation, across a span of 5 centuries. And in the data, hidden. Inside modern populations that have never given it a second thought, priestly families in North India are quietly carrying more of that signal than almost anyone else on the subcontinent. None of this was supposed to be recoverable. All of it turned out to be sitting in the DNA the whole time. For more than 100 years, the accepted story of who Indians are and where they came from ran through a single, tidy narrative. A fair, skinned Aryan population arriving from outside, meeting a darker indigenous population already there, one replacing or subjugating the other. That story shaped colonial-era anthropology, nationalist politics on more than one side, and even how caste itself got explained to the outside world. It was repeated in textbooks, in political speeches, and in casual conversation, treated as settled fact by people who had never once seen a shred of direct genetic evidence for it, because until very recently, no such evidence existed to see. Ancient DNA has now spoken directly from bones in the ground. And it turns out almost nobody on any side of that old argument had the full picture. This finding is not fringe. It comes from Harvard Medical School, the Broad Institute, the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleosciences in Lucknow, and India's own Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute. Working together, publishing in Cell and Science, 2 of the most rigorously peer-reviewed journals in the world. The lead figures are David Reich, one of the most cited population geneticists alive, Vaghish Narasimhan, Niraj Rai, and Indian archaeologist Vasant Shinde, who spent years excavating the site this story begins at. This is not a documentary built on speculation. It is built on sequenced genomes, compared against hundreds of ancient skeletons across 3 continents. It also isn't the first time anyone tried to answer this question. Geneticists had been circling this problem using modern DNA alone since at least 2009, and archaeologists had been arguing over migration versus indigenous development for closer to 2 centuries before that. What changed, and changed everything, was the ability to extract usable genetic material directly from skeletons buried in a region where heat and humidity destroyed DNA faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. For years, South Asia was treated as something close to a black hole for ancient DNA research, a place where the science simply could not reach far enough back to test any of the competing theories directly. Rakhigarhi is the moment that black hole finally cracked open. Here's a way to picture what these scientists are actually doing, because ancient DNA analysis can sound abstract until you see the mechanics. Imagine every population on Earth is a paint color mixed from a small number of original pigments over thousands of years. You can't unmix a finished color by looking at it, but if you had samples of the original pigments themselves, straight from the tube, you could measure exactly how much of each went into the final blend. That is what ancient DNA gives geneticists that modern DNA alone never could. Samples of the original unmixed populations, taken directly from skeletons before those populations had a chance to blend into what exists today. Modern Indian DNA is the finished mixed paint. Ancient DNA is the individual tubes of pigment that made it, recovered straight from the source, still unmixed. So who were the original pigments in the Indian subcontinent? 3 groups, and this is where the story actually starts moving. The oldest layer goes back tens of thousands of years, long before agriculture, long before any city. These were the first modern humans to reach South Asia, part of the same out-of-Africa migration that populated the rest of Eurasia, likely moving along the coastline sometime between 50 and 65,000 years ago. Geneticists call this ancestry AASI, Ancient Ancestral South Indian, and the closest living relatives to that original population today are the Onge, an indigenous people of the Andaman Islands, whose isolation for tens of thousands of years preserved a genetic signature almost nowhere else survives in pure form. The Onge today number only a few hundred people. And yet, that small isolated population is, genetically, the closest living window anyone has into what the very first people to walk across South Asia actually carried in their DNA. Every single person on the Indian subcontinent today carries some trace of this deep, ancient lineage. That is the floor everything else got built on top of. The second layer arrived with farming. Starting around 7,000 years ago, people connected to the early agricultural populations of Iran began moving into and mixing with the AASI population, bringing with them the crops, livestock, and technologies that would eventually give rise to the great cities of the Indus Valley. This wasn't a single dramatic wave. It was centuries of gradual contact and intermarriage, the two populations blending, along what geneticists describe as a genetic cline, a gradient rather than a hard boundary stretching from the Iranian plateau into the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwest India. By the time this blended population had matured into the sophisticated society that would build Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Rakhigarhi, the mixing itself was already thousands of years in the past, baked into the population's DNA long before the first standardized brick was ever fired. This Iranian-related ancestry, combined with AASI, is what Narasimhan and his colleagues call Indus periphery ancestry, and in 2019, that theoretical population stopped being theoretical. That's exactly where Rakhigarhi comes back in. Researchers screened 61 skeletons from that site, the largest known city of the Indus Valley civilization, hunting for anything with DNA intact enough to sequence. 60 of them yielded nothing usable. India's hot, humid climate is close to the worst possible environment for preserving genetic material. DNA strands break down within decades in conditions like that, which is exactly why, before this project, nobody had ever managed to pull a usable ancient genome out of the Indus Valley at all, despite the civilization being excavated for over a century. One skeleton did yield something, barely. A woman now labeled I61113, and it took the team more than 100 sequencing attempts to pull a genome out of what little survived. What that genome showed, published by Shinde, Narasimhan, and Reich's team in Cell in September 2019, was almost entirely AASI and Iranian-related ancestry. 2 ingredients, not 3. Here's the part that made headlines across India overnight. Her genome contained 0 detectable steppe pastoralist ancestry. Sit with that for a second, because it directly answers half of the old colonial question. If the woman who lived and died inside a mature Harappan city around 2500 BCE carried no steppe-related DNA at all, then whoever built the Indus Valley civilizations, granaries and drainage systems were not, themselves, migrants from the Eurasian steppe. The people who engineered one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban societies were a blend of South Asia's oldest inhabitants and early Iranian-related farmers. Full stop. That part of the old invasion narrative simply does not survive contact with her genome. But that raises the obvious next question, and it's the one this story has been building toward the entire time. If the Harappans themselves had no steppe ancestry, where does the third ingredient, the one present in nearly every South Asian today, actually come from? And when? Because it has to come from somewhere. It shows up in the DNA of over 1 billion people alive right now. It just isn't in her. Quickly, before going further, here's everything on the table so far. Layer 1. ALSI, tens of thousands of years old. The deep original population still visible today in the Onge of the Andaman Islands. Layer 2. Iranian-related farmer ancestry, arriving around 7,000 years ago, mixing with AASI to form the Indus periphery population, the same population that built Rakhigarhi. 2 layers confirmed directly from a Harappan skeleton. 1 layer still unaccounted for. The answer came from a study even larger than Rakhigarhi. In 2019, the same year as the Rakhigarhi paper, Narasimhan's team published a separate analysis in Science built from 523 ancient genomes stretching across Iran, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and South Asia, the largest ancient DNA dataset of its kind ever, assembled for this region. And inside that mountain of data, they found something moving steadily southward. Starting around 2300 to 1500 BCE, a period archaeologists already knew as the Middle to Late Bronze Age, populations genetically linked to the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe began spreading south through Central Asia. They didn't move in a straight line. On the way, in a region called Turin, they encountered an already established Bronze Age civilization known as the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, a network of walled cities with irrigation canals and monumental architecture of its own. The genetic data shows something the archaeology alone never could. The steppe migrants barely mixed with the BMAC population at all. They moved through it, largely bypassing it, and kept heading south toward the subcontinent. This is the third ingredient, steppe pastoralist ancestry, and it carries the exact same genetic signature found in Bronze Age skeletons from Eastern Europe. Same source population, 2 completely different destinations, thousands of kilometers apart, both reshaped by the same migrating group. That single genetic thread is also, according to Narasimhan and Reich's team, very likely the mechanism that carried the ancestor language of Sanskrit into South Asia, while a closely related branch carried Balto-Slavic languages into Eastern Europe. 1 population, 2 language families, 1 shared point of origin. Here's a detail that didn't make most headlines, but probably should have. Buried inside that same 523 genome dataset, the researchers found something unexpected when they looked at modern populations grouped by traditional priestly status. Brahmin and Bhumihar communities in North India showed a measurable excess of steppe-related ancestry compared to other groups with a similar overall proportion of West Eurasian DNA. Not a small statistical wobble. A consistent, flagged outlier sitting right there in the data. Nobody had to speculate about which communities in modern India carry more of that third ancestral layer. The genomes simply showed it. Numbers as punctuation moment, because this is the single most important span in the entire story, 500 years. That's roughly the window, somewhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE, in which this steppe ancestry moved into South Asia and began mixing into the existing Indus periphery population. 500 years, not an invasion measured in weeks, not a single army crossing a mountain pass, a slow demographic tide, arriving generations after the mature Indus cities had already begun, declining on their own for reasons that likely had far more to do with shifting river systems and climate stress than any incoming population. If you're starting to see how this reframes the entire old story, that's exactly the moment worth pausing on, because it's the one detail most popular retellings get wrong in both directions. Here's where it gets even more specific, and it's worth staying with the details because this is the part that actually settles the debate rather than just complicating it. The Rakhigarhi woman, dated to roughly 2500 BCE, predates this steppe migration entirely. That's not a coincidence of sampling. It's the whole explanation. She lived and died before the third ingredient ever arrived. Later, skeletons from the Swat Valley in what is now northern Pakistan, dated centuries after her, do show steppe ancestry appearing, and the Y chromosome marker geneticists associate with steppe pastoralist men called R18Z93 is common across modern South Asia today, but is entirely absent in every sample older than 2000 BCE. The timeline isn't ambiguous. It's written directly into which skeletons have the marker and which ones simply don't. In the next part of this, it's worth naming what all three of these ingredients add up to today, because this is where the science stops being abstract and starts describing the person sitting across from you on a train in Delhi or Chennai. Modern South Asian populations are best modeled not as one ancestry or two, but as a gradient, a sliding mixture of AASI, Iranian-related and steppe-related ancestry, with the proportions shifting depending on region, community, and caste group. Populations in the north and among certain priestly communities tend to carry a higher proportion of steppe-related ancestry. Populations in the south carry a higher proportion of AASI. Nobody, in any region, is one pure ingredient. Everybody is the blend. That gradient itself has a name in the scientific literature, going back even before Narasimhan's 2019 papers. In 2009, Reich and colleagues first proposed modeling South Asian ancestry as a mixture of what they called ancestral North Indians and ancestral South Indians, ANI and ASI for short, a framework built entirely from modern DNA, before any ancient genomes from the region existed at all. That original model was a genuine breakthrough at the time, and it correctly predicted that a two-way gradient would explain most of the variation researchers were seeing in living populations. But a model built only from modern DNA has a built-in limitation. It can tell you that a mixture happened without being able to tell you when, or in what order, or from exactly how, many original sources. What the Rakhigarhi skeleton in the 500 genome steppe study did, a decade later, was take that abstract two-part statistical model and finally attach real dates, real migration routes, and a third deeper layer underneath it that the original 2009 framework could not yet see. So here is the honest, careful version of where the science actually stands, because a story with this much cultural weight deserves the caveat every bit as much as it deserves the reveal. Ancient DNA, I can tell you, with real confidence, when a population arrived, roughly how large its genetic contribution was, and how it blended with the people already there. What it cannot tell you is what language any specific ancient individual spoke, what religion they practiced, or how they thought of their own identity, because none of that fossilizes. The link between steppe ancestry and the spread of Indo-European languages is the leading explanation among linguists and geneticists, supported by geography, timing, and parallel. Cases in Europe, but it remains an inference built from correlation, not something read directly off a chromosome. It's also worth being precise that only one individual genome has ever been successfully sequenced directly from the Indus Valley civilization itself. Rakhigarhi tells us a great deal, but the researchers who published it were explicit that a single skeleton cannot represent the full genetic diversity of an entire civilization spread across hundreds of sites and centuries of time, and further sampling could still refine or complicate the picture as tropical DNA preservation technology improves. The Brahmin and Bhumihar finding, too, deserves the same caution. It describes a population-level statistical pattern averaged across sampled individuals, not a claim about any single person's ancestry. And it says nothing at all about social status, merit, or worth, only about the demographic history of a group. And politically, this remains a genuinely contested subject inside India, where the same genetic data gets read through very different lenses depending on who is doing the reading. Some point to the Rakhigarhi result as vindication that the Indus Valley civilization was purely indigenous. Others point to the confirmed steppe migration as vindication of the older Indo-Aryan migration framework. The genetics itself doesn't settle those arguments because the genetics was never trying to answer a political question in the first place. It only settles the narrower, factual question of when and how much each ancestral population contributed. And on that narrower question, the data across multiple independent studies from different labs, using different methods, now points in the same direction. If this kind of layered detective work through ancient bones is the part that hooked you, this channel has more of exactly this coming, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. What's left, once you set the politics aside and just look at the genomes, is something stranger and more interesting than either the old invasion story or the old denial of it. Nobody arrived to a genetically empty subcontinent. Nobody was simply erased and replaced. A population that had already been rooted in South Asia for tens of thousands of years absorbed newcomers twice, thousands of years apart, once from Iran, once from the steppe, each time blending rather than vanishing, each time adding a layer without erasing the ones beneath it. The woman from Rakhigarhi carried 2 of those 3 layers in her bones the whole time, waiting 4,500 years for a lab with the right tools to finally read them. Think about what that actually means for the roughly 1.5 billion people living across South Asia today. Every one of them, whatever language they speak, whatever region their family calls home, whatever community they were born into, carries some measurable trace of all 3 of these ancient populations. The AASI hunter-gatherers who arrived tens of thousands of years before anyone built a city. The Iranian-related farmers who taught that population agriculture and gave rise to one of the ancient world's great civilizations. And the steppe pastoralists who arrived 1,000 years after Rakhigarhi's cities had already begun to decline, carrying with them a language family that would eventually produce Sanskrit, and through Sanskrit, an enormous share of the vocabulary spoken across the subcontinent today. None of the old, simpler stories captured that. Not the colonial one, not either of the modern political rewrites of it. Only the bones did. A century of argument built on skull measurements, skin tone, and language trees, and it took one woman's skeleton and 523 others to finally settle the parts of it that could actually be settled. Everyone alive across the subcontinent today is walking evidence of at least 2 migrations nobody living can remember, and a population that was there long before either one arrived to be mixed into. The bones simply outlasted the argument. Tell me in the comments which surprised you more, that the Harappans who built those cities had 0 steppe ancestry, or that the steppe migration itself took roughly 500 years rather than a single invasion.